Thank you very, very much to Tara for that introduction to the Australian dietary guidelines and the evidence or lack of it for cereal fibre and the benefits in terms of preventing type 2 diabetes. So I'm a GP working here in Canberra, and I've had a long-term interest in nutrition and low carbohydrate diets. And the title of this talk is, Does Fibre Matter? And my point of departure is where the conclusion that Tara reached with her talk, that if eating carbohydrate in the form of whole grains for the benefit of that fibre that reduces the absorption of those very carbs is just sheer nonsense. So thank you very much, Tara. The full title of my talk is if a low carbohydrate diet can be low fibre, low fibre or high fibre, does fibre matter? The short answer is probably not. The long answer is maybe, who knows, it may not. My long answer is based on a series of questions. So I'm going to have a look at the conventional view of fibre, which is that fibre is fabulous and we all ought to eat lots of it. And I'm going to throw out some contradictory ideas which might help us rethink fibre. So this is part of the theme of controversy in this weekend. So what I'm going to look at is what are the health claims for fibre? What is the evidence that fibre is good for us? Is a low carbohydrate diet also a low fibre diet? Are cereals necessary for human health? And look, I think Tara's actually already answered the question, who benefits from the story that whole grains equal health? So briefly, this is Fibre 101, a brief introduction. What is fibre? It's the indigestible part of plant food. And there are actually many different kinds of fibre, and they vary by size of particle, by chemical structure, by solubility, viscosity, meaning how sticky it is, and fermentability. And all of these factors help contribute to the health effects of that fibre in people. So there's many different kinds of fibre: soluble fibre, insoluble fibre, resistant starch, and FODMAPS. I actually think the term fibre is misleading. It's not a thread. Fibres are simply short chains of sugars. They're usually, many of them are oligosaccharides, some of them are longer chains of sugars, but the point is that they're just molecules of sugars all joined together with various kinds of chemical bonds between those sugars. Some of those fibres are prebiotic. So what does that mean? Well, prebiotics are fibre that feed friendly bacteria, and foods that are high in prebiotics include wheat-based foods, things like Jerusalem artichokes. Onions and leeks contain something called fructans, which is a kind of fibre, and also a FODMAPS. And potatoes which are cooked and cooled, the starch changes, becomes less digestible and becomes a form of resistant starch. And my colleague Melissa Luxmore, who's waiting in the wings, will probably go into this in somewhat more detail. So there's also this thing called FODMAPS, which again strikes fear into the hearts of many people with irritable bowel syndrome. They've been told that they've got a FODMAPS intolerance. FODMAPS are typically a form of fibre. They're usually from plant foods. They're often prebiotic foods. They're bits of mostly plants that are not digested and which feed the bacteria, and which are fermented by gut bacteria and produce products such as carbon dioxide and methane gases that trigger IBS symptoms in susceptible people. So FODMAPS stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides and polyols. And of all those things, most of them are found in plant foods, with the exception of things like lactose, which are, lactose is milk sugar. So that's a combination of galactose and glucose, forming lactose, which is a disaccharide from milk. So hold these thoughts for a moment. Now, this is the big claim, the miracle of fibre, and I've taken this straight from this organisation, Nutrition Australia, which Tara mentioned. Soluble fibre helps to slow the emptying process of our stomachs and helps you feel fuller. It helps to lower cholesterol and stabilise your blood glucose levels. And insoluble fibre absorbs water to soften the content of our bowels and support regular bowel motions. It helps to keep us full and keep the bowel environment healthy. So here are all the big claims. Feel fuller, fill you up, lose weight, feed the good bacteria, colon health and regularity, cure constipation and diverticular disease, prevent disease such as diabetes, cancer and heart disease, and lower cholesterol, yay. Stabilise blood glucose. So in short, eat whole grains or die. So part of my strategy today is to kind of create, show us what the conventional narrative is and say, actually, there's a whole other story here which we don't hear enough about. And the first thing I'm going to mention is that satiety is not simply a function of fibre, fullness or volume. I actually suspect that fibre equals fullness equation is probably a myth. Your body's ability to regulate appetite and weight is very complex and is determined by a whole bunch of things. And here is a complex diagram which I've borrowed from Dr. Lucy Burns in Melbourne, who did a really great talk for Low Carb Down Under, and she called it the hormonal approach to obesity. And what you can see here is that there's a whole lot of hormones which contribute to satiety and appetite. So there are things like insulin and leptin. There's also ghrelin and cholecystokinin. And all of these things have a role to play in this complex regulation of appetite and weight. The idea that fibre helps you feel fuller may not be true for some people. I have a friend who, when she gets hungry, she eats an apple, fills her up. I eat an apple and I'm starving. I'm even more hungry after I eat the apple. Fat and protein helps satiety, and many people who are on carnivore diets eating zero fibre report that they feel less hungry, they feel satisfied, but also there's less bloating. So, think about that. Okay, back to the conventional narrative. How much fibre do we need? Well, this is from Nutrition Australia again, and their recommendation is for men 30 grams of fibre a day and for women 25 grams of fibre a day. And, quote, eating a variety of plant-based foods will help you get enough fibre each day. So again, it's eat plants or die. And this is their most recent healthy food pyramid, and they have moved the grains up a level, so it's not the base of the pyramid. But my comment is just what we need, another food pyramid. A more sophisticated version of the eat fibre or die story is based on research in the last 10 or 15 years into the gut microbiota. Microbiome is the word of the decade. The argument is that fibre is a powerful determinant of the range of microbes in our gut through feeding the gut bacteria. So the idea is that fibre increases diversity of gut bacteria and this improves health. So one of the articles that I had a close look at actually says a variety of fibre in the diet increases microbial diversity, and they comment on the inverse relationship between diversity and disease states. And we'll come back to what that study found shortly. So there's an ecological analogy here, and that's the analogy of the forest. And this is an analogy that I actually, really resonates for me, and I actually think there's a lot to be said for diversity. In a forest, there are multiple functions which are shared between species, and this helps with overall ecological resilience. And in our guts, the idea is that gut bugs have many functions. They do a whole lot of beneficial functions for us. They eat the things that we can't digest, so the fibre. They produce beneficial substances such as vitamins, amino acids, short-chain fatty acids such as butyrate. They help keep our gut lining healthy. They interact with our immune system and our nervous system. And the idea here is that monoculture is not good for health. It's not good in a forest. A monoculture of pine trees, for example, is very prone to the problems of drought and disease. And the analogy is that monoculture in our gut is not good for us either. There's just a little bit of a problem with this, which is that everything feeds the microbes. It's not just fibre from plant foods that feed the microbes. If anybody here has worked in a laboratory or worked in a hospital, you'll know that the rate-limiting growth factors for many bacteria are amino acids, so things derived from proteins. If you want to grow bugs, get a bottle of broth or get a blood agar plate. And poo is really just, and it's a whole lot of bacteria really, growing on food residues. And additionally, fat and bile have profound impact on gut microbiota. It's not a simple relationship between fat, bile and microbes. But the point is that you can still eat animal products only and have a bowel motion. So here are some inconvenient findings. Getting back to that article, So et al. 2018, it was a systematic review and meta-analysis of dietary interventions. The population is healthy adults, i.e. us. The outcomes that they showed was that there was a lack of effect of dietary fibre interventions on gut microbe diversity. So in these healthy adults, they looked at a whole lot of studies that gave fibre interventions, particularly cereal fibre, and found no improvement in the diversity of gut bacteria. It's a null finding. The authors try to rescue the null finding by arguing that fibre was found to increase abundance of things like lactobacilli, bifidose and butyrate production, and they assume that this is good too, and hence the overall conclusion is the beneficial effects of dietary fibre on gut health. But I actually suspect, I'm a bit sceptical about this, and I suspect they're pushing poo uphill, frankly. And I think this study is quite a good example of how studies get reported to fit in with the dominant paradigm. And the dominant paradigm is fibre is beaut. But I actually think the science is far from settled. And in fact, we don't know what normal is. And this slide is, I'm trying to illustrate this idea of there's actually many kinds of normal. Getting back to that forest analogy, there are many kinds of forests in the world, and even something that looks like a desert is actually full of ecological richness. And there's probably, by analogy, there's probably many kinds of human gut biomes. What's normal? Hadza African, Inuit, who live largely on meat and blubber, if they're living a traditional diet. Other Indigenous people eating a hunter-gatherer diet. Is a vegan microbiome normal? Is a carnivore microbiome normal? The one thing that I would say is that I suspect that a person eating a standard American or Australian diet of pizza, ice cream, bickies and cereal probably doesn't have a normal microbiome. So here's some more inconvenient findings. The question is, does fibre protect against diverticular disease? And the myth of fibre says that Westerners on low fibre diets have far more diverticular disease compared to, say, rural Africans. And this was research from the 1970s, and Dennis Burkett is when this this story came about. And conventional doctors tell people with diverticular disease to eat lots of fibre, which conveniently ignores a series of studies by a gastroenterological group in the US led by Piri et al. In the last decade. In this particular study, they compared people with diverticular disease found at colonoscopy and a whole bunch of people who had normal colons at colonoscopy. And they asked these two groups of people a whole lot of questions about their diet and their bowel habit. And the inconvenient finding is that there was no association between dietary fibre intake and diverticulosis. And in fact, people who had hard, lumpy stools actually had decreased risk of diverticulosis. Now, I'm wondering, why is this study not being talked about? In 2020, doctors are still telling patients with diverticular disease to eat lots of fibre. And here is an example from the Gut Foundation in Australia, basically saying a minimum of 30 grams of dietary fibre a day is usually required, which is considerably more than the average Australian eats. So the fibre is Butte story is still alive and well, despite evidence to the contrary. Here's another inconvenient question, another inconvenient, I guess, study. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Mason's famous talk for Low Carb Down Under, where I think it was May 2018 in Sydney, and he quoted the Ho et al. Study from 2012. In this paper, 63 people with severe constipation went on a low fibre diet for 2 weeks. In all of them, their constipation improved a lot. 6 months later, 41 of those original 63 people remained on a low fibre diet. People who stopped or reduced dietary fibre had significant improvement in their symptoms. And this is news that will shock a lot of doctors. A couple of other papers that don't quite toe the dietary fibre line. The one that I've put up on the slide is Yang et al. Effects of dietary fibre on constipation. Fibre is moderately effective, but also causes moderate, the conclusion there is that dietary fibre intake can obviously increase stool frequency in patients with constipation. It does not obviously improve stool consistency, treatment success, laxative use, or painful defecation. So the problem is dietary fibre can increase the amount of poo, but doesn't make it more comfortable. So you have more painful defecation. Another paper, Christodoulis et al. 2016, fibre is moderately effective, but also causes moderate gastrointestinal side effects. This is well known clinically. Some people, if you pour more fibre into their gut, it simply gets worse. This is not news. And a paper, Suarez and Ford 2016, soluble fibre may be of benefit in chronic idiopathic constipation, but data for insoluble fibre, such as whole grains, are conflicting. More data required. So moving on from gut health to heart health. If you want to give a dietitian a heart attack, tell them that you're on a low carbohydrate, healthy fat, no grain diet. Because their assumption is that whole grains, particularly cereal fibre, equates with health. And the big criticism, one of the big criticisms of low carbohydrate approaches is too much fat and not enough fibre. Except that there's actually no good evidence that whole grain fibre will reduce your cardiovascular risk. Now, I've got two papers here. The one on the left, Kelly et al., is a Cochrane review from 2017, reached the same conclusions as the Cochrane review from about a decade ago. There is insufficient evidence from randomised controlled trials to date to recommend consumption of whole grains to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease or lower blood cholesterol or blood pressure, and a similar conclusion from a Health Canada review in 2013. And yet the Australian Dietary Guidelines are still big on grains and whole grains, and the myth of fibre persists. So the next question is a low carbohydrate, healthy fat diet really low fibre? And for this slide, I am very grateful to Zoe Harcombe. And if you haven't already subscribed to Zoe Harcombe, it's well worth the modest cost. And on this diagram, what she's done is on the left-hand side, she has foods that fall into the low carbohydrate category, and on the right-hand side, the high carbohydrate category. And on the top are the high fibre foods, and on the bottom are the low fibre foods. So quadrants, let's see if I can get this pointer working. Quadrant A has high fibre, low carbohydrate food, vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, low sugar fruit, nuts and seeds. In quadrant C, we have low fibre and low carbohydrate foods, things like meat, fish, eggs and dairy, which, funnily enough, quadrants A and C happen to be the foods that most of us who are doing a low carb approach are eating. What Zoe points out in her analysis is that you can actually get more fibre and less calories and considerably less sugar if you eat from quadrants A and C compared to if you eat from quadrants B and D. She also points out that eating 30 grams of fibre per day doesn't necessarily confer any particular health benefits, except that your dietitian won't have that heart attack. There are lots of approaches to low carb, including high fibre, low fibre and zero fibre. Here's something from one of my other heroes, Dr. David Unwin, who points out in one of his papers that the average British diet, which is bad, has about 14 grams of fibre per day. By following his simple low carbohydrate, healthy fat rules, which are basically eat real food, you will get more fibre, probably about 25 grams a day. So his argument is that your basic real food diet that is whole grain deficient will probably give you more fibre than your basic crappy Western diet. And Dr. Unwin's dietary advice is summed up on this one page. Reduce starchy carbs a lot, get rid of the white stuff, eat plenty of green stuff, go easy on the high sugar fruits, eat healthy protein, fats are fine in moderation. Not terribly difficult and a really good start. If you're still really hung up in fibre and you really want some, might I recommend Dr. Bruckner's 3-seed bread. The recipe for this is found in his book called Fat Lot of Good. It's made with psyllium. It's really awesome toasted with brie or butter melted over it. And it contains about 10 grams of fibre per slice, which shits over a slice of whole grain bread any day. Pardon me. So getting back to my question, does fibre matter? Where I've got to with this is, yes, it probably matters if you're eating a standard American or Australian diet of highly processed food. But if you're eating a high diet which is high quality real food, my hunch is that it is much less important.